I believe he is the finest running back to ever wear an NFL uniform.
It means a lot for me to get to 2,000 yards.
Pick a side. Only two options, be with the winners or the other guys. Yeah, ain't no time. We already on the way. Better get themselves in line. Thought I told you we don't play.
We did some great things. I mean, we really did, man, and we made a lot of people happy.
And you think you're going to have success. I didn't expect just this much.
Just to be in this position right now, it's a blessing.
Franchise record 238 yards.
Every time I touch on the field, I try to play hard, run tough.
The team going nuts, the score going up, morale going down, the fans packing up.
Jerome Harrison put together the number 3 all-time rushing performance in pro football.
Welcome into fantasy football yesterday. We're spending the entire week here on CBS Sports HQ taking a look back at some of the best fantasy performances of all time. Well, at least going back to 1997. That's when Sportsline started and we became the leader in the fantasy industry. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Dave Richard. Joining us remotely, Heath Cummings and Adam Azer. We're going to spend the entire week looking back on some of the best fantasy performances, seasons, best busts, best performances on a one-game basis. We're going to have a lot of fun here on CBS Sports HQ. And what we're going to do today is we're going to break down the ultimate fantasy draft that we did. 8 members of our CBS Sports staff took part in a 9-round draft. You could draft 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and 2 flexes. And these were the best seasons of a particular player. You cannot draft the player twice. So, for example, if you took Randy Moss in 2007, which is the best season ever for a wide receiver, you also could not take his performance in 2003. So this was a fun exercise that we did. We had a lot of fun throughout the week getting ready to have this week full of fun for you guys to have a look back at some of these historical moments. So let's start with this draft that we did, gentlemen. And we had the first round, no surprise, or maybe there was a surprise with the players that were selected at the top. Some different approaches to how we all built our teams. Marshall Faulk here. Dave had the first pick. He took Faulk, followed by me with LaDainian Tomlinson. Keith Cummings picking third, had Christian McCaffrey, and Adam Azer all the way down at 8, taking Jimmy Graham. So as you see here, best tight end, Rob Gronkowski in 2011. Best wide receiver, Randy Moss in 2007. So let's get into it with the guys at the top. And so you have Faulk versus Tomlinson. So Dave, Faulk played 14 games in 2000. He averaged 32.5 points per game that year. But LaDainian Tomlinson outscored him 483 to 455, but LT's points per game at 30.1. I know you were looking more at average than total points. Tell us why Faulk was first for you.
It was a real close call, and I couldn't believe it, but the scoring that we're using for this is PPR, and that really put Marshall Faulk at a decisive edge over LaDainian Tomlinson. He had 2.4 more fantasy points per game than LaDainian Tomlinson did back when Faulk was playing in 2000. 5.4 yards per carry, 10.2 yards per catch, 2 games with over 100 receiving yards, 10 games with at least 5 catches. LT only had 5. He was awesome. He had the 3rd most fantasy points for a running back all time, and he missed 2 games. He didn't fumble once. I thought that was good enough, on top of the fact that he averaged more fantasy points than Tomlinson.
All right, so Heath, you were picking third. I had the second pick. I was taking Tomlinson without hesitation because many people do consider it the best fantasy season of all time. Again, total points, he was just absolutely amazing at 483.1. But if you had the choice at number 1, Heath, what would you have done? Would you have taken the best points per game, or would you have taken the best total points?
For most of this draft, especially in the early rounds, I just went with total points. Now, I think this one might be a little bit unique because it's something I found this morning. In the fantasy playoffs, which is where things really matter the most to fantasy managers, Marshall Faulk was incredible that year. He outscored LaDainian Tomlinson by almost 9 points per game in those 3 games, scored 8 touchdowns. They both had more than 400 yards in the fantasy playoffs, but Faulk caught a lot more passes. So I would probably go Faulk just barely over Tomlinson, but for most of this draft, and for sure when I took McCaffrey number 3, I focused more on total fantasy points than points per game.
On Tuesday, we're going to spend some time looking at the Mount Rushmore of every position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. No surprise, those 2 guys Faulk, and Tomlinson will almost certainly be on the running back Mount Rushmore. The tight end Mount Rushmore probably going to feature Jimmy Graham and Rob Gronkowski. And again, you look at these two tight ends, and as we found when we kind of broke this down on our Fantasy Football Today podcast, running backs dominated this draft, dominated this era. So building your team was a little bit of a challenge. And so, Adam, for you took Graham with the last pick in round 1. Again, Gronk went with the 4th selection in round 1. His season in 2011, Graham's season in 2013. So, Adam, when you took Jimmy Graham, what was the thought process there? And just take us through kind of taking 2 of the 3 tight ends who averaged at least 18 points per game during this era, the third guy being Travis Kelce in 2018.
Huge drop-off after that in terms of points per game. So why would Rob Gronkowski go ahead of somebody like Priest Holmes, the 2003 version of Priest Holmes? So that was Chris Towers' pick. I think it was a fine pick because I didn't just look at it as, hey, let's get the most points. I mean, that's kind of an easy way to approach it, and I wouldn't fault you if you did approach it that way, but I looked for fantasy impact. I looked at average draft position, and I looked at how much better this player was than everyone else at the position. Rob Gronkowski was the 12th tight end off the board in 2011. This season was amazing for him. It was the second year in the league, and he just exploded and wasn't supposed to be quite that good. Now, I didn't have a chance to take Gronkowski, but that was the case to take him earlier. I took Jimmy Graham. I really wanted to take Randy Moss, the 2007 version of Moss, but he went 1 pick ahead of me. I took Graham because of all the tight ends from 2001 through 2019. Jimmy Graham, he finished number 1 that year, and he had the highest margin, the biggest margin of difference between tight end 1 and tight end 2. He scored more than 80 more points in PPR than the second tight end that year. So it was just an absolutely dominating year. I think he had 16 or 17 touchdowns. He had one fewer than Rob Gronkowski had in that magical 2011 season. And nobody else in this era at the tight end position had more than 12 touchdowns. So it was a dominating year. He really was so far ahead of the pack at tight end. And even though he didn't score as many points as some of the running backs and wide receivers who were on the board, it was his dominance at the position that put him over the top, made him the round 1 pick for me.
Dave, you waited on a tight end, and again, everybody had a different approach in building their team. You didn't take your tight end until Tony Gonzalez in round 8. Your thoughts on waiting on the position? Was that something you planned or just kind of worked out that way?
I would have taken Gronk if he was there in round 2, but I knew he wasn't going to make it to round 2. He was too good of a tight end. And the thought that I had was just studying that points per game, which is what matters to me the most. Gronk averaged a little more than 20 PPR points per game.
Only one over 20 points.
The only one over 20 points. And there were 25 instances of receivers getting more than 20 PPR points per game. So I didn't want to overvalue the tight end position. I decided to wait.
If you take a look at the recap of the draft on CBSSports.com, you'll see that the pick that I regret, which we'll talk about coming up when we show you round 2, is Travis Kelce in round 2, simply because while he was excellent, I do think that, as Dave sort of alluded to with the wide receivers and the running backs, as dominant as they were, you could have waited on tight end, still got a good player, and ended up with a good roster. Just kind of, we'll give you an indication of how all these teams did when we break down our teams coming up later in the show, but total points versus points per game and how you constructed your roster sort of mattered here, but we really didn't have a lot of guidelines in terms of what we were doing in building our team. Were we trying to get the most total points? Were we trying to get points per game? Everybody kind of took a little bit of a different approach. And so Adam alluded to this. Randy Moss was a player that he wanted. He went with the second to last pick in the first round. I want to kind of compare him, though, to the 2 players who were drafted in front of him, Priest Holmes and Steven Jackson, because we look at this and we say, okay, wide receiver, best wide receiver season of this era, 2007 for Randy Moss, not in terms of points per game, but total points. But you look at him in comparison to Holmes, Priest Holmes, who averaged 27.8 points per game, and Steven Jackson, who was at 25.7. Moss was at 24 points per game. Heath, does it surprise you that given the PPR scoring that Moss wasn't necessarily a little bit better, just given the fact, as you see here, his numbers, the 23 touchdowns, the thing that stands out the most?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is generally speaking, you're going to see the great running backs have more yards, and receivers hope to make up for it with catches. He was such a huge yards per catch guy. It wasn't like he was catching 140 passes like Marvin Harrison or Michael Thomas. Now, he did score 23 touchdowns that year, but back in that era, we had running backs scoring 20-plus touchdowns with a little more regularity than we do now. So it was just kind of hard for a receiver. Now, I do think that Moss is still justified as a first-round pick because it's not just the total number of fantasy points they scored per game, but also how they compare versus their position. And there were a lot more running backs over 23 or 24 points per game available than there were wide receivers. So Moss gives you a pretty big edge at number 1 wide receiver over the rest of the league. You just have to make sure you make up for that running back weakness later.
Let's take a look now at round 2 of our ultimate fantasy draft. Adam had the last pick in round 1. First pick in round 2, as you see the names here that came off the board, starting with another wide receiver in Antonio Brown, his season from 2014, followed by a couple of running backs, Arian Foster and David Johnson. Finally, the quarterbacks start to come off the board, but maybe not the order that you would expect. Patrick Mahomes over Peyton Manning. We'll talk about that coming up in a second. And then to wrap up the first round, I took Travis Kelce at 15, Dave taking Todd Gurley at 16. So let's start with the running backs here first. And so when you look at, let's start with Antonio Brown here first. And looking at the wide receiver situation, comparing him to Arian Foster and David Johnson. So Adam, what was the choice for you taking Brown over one of those running backs after passing on a running back in the first round? Why was Brown so important to you?
Well, I think that the running backs that went in the first round were the no-brainers, the best of the best, and unfortunately I was not able to get them. 3 receivers. We had to start 3 receivers plus 2 flex positions in a PPR league, so I wanted to get a guy who had 129 catches. And I went with Antonio Brown over Marvin Harrison because they basically, in their best seasons, Harrison in 2002, Brown in 2014, they were within 1.3 fantasy points of each other in PPR. So it's essentially a tie. I went with Antonio Brown because that year, his ADP, he was the 8th wide receiver off the board, and he finished as number 1. A little bit better value than what you got out of Marvin Harrison, but obviously they both were incredible. They scored almost the same amount of fantasy points. Harrison had more catches and yards. Antonio Brown had 2 more touchdowns. So, I went with Brown because in a 3-receiver league, I knew I wasn't picking again until the end of round 3. And I wanted to make sure I had a stud wide receiver. I felt like maybe everybody else, was going to shy away a little bit from running backs because, 4 of you picked running backs in the first round. So, my running back's a little weak, as we'll see later. I couldn't pass up Antonio Brown, though.
Understandably so, and I think people looking at the current version of Antonio Brown trying to get back into the NFL forget just how dominant he was. Another player who I'm sure will make his debut on the Mount Rushmore when we talk about the wide receiver position. Dave, we got a couple running backs in this round that were interesting. Arian Foster in 2010 and David Johnson in 2016. Your approach would probably not be the way that these guys were drafted because Foster was taken ahead of Johnson. Johnson better points per game. He was at 25.1, Foster 24.3. Again, we kind of look at what these guys are now. David Johnson, though, that 2016 season was pretty special.
It was amazing, and he caught a ton of passes, and he was really starting to take off, and we thought this was going to be it for David Johnson. He would just be that guy. And Chris Johnson had a monster season as well. It really just comes down to what type of flavor you wanted for your all-time fantasy team. If you're looking for guys that played 15 or 16 games and just racked up a ton of numbers, hey, they were perfect for you. It wasn't what I did when I got Todd Gurley. First of all, I'm picking at the end of round 2, so it's a little bit hard for me to go and say, well, I took Gurley over these guys. I didn't have the choice. Gurley did average over 25 PPR fantasy points per game. That was higher than any remaining non-quarterback when I picked. He's top 20 among all running backs in total PPR fantasy points in the era that we're talking about, 1997 to present day, and one of 4 running backs who had 10 rushing touchdowns and 6 receiving touchdowns in the same season. He also totaled over 2,000 yards. All 3 of these guys were amazing. Throw in Arian Foster, that's 4. That's why they were second-round picks in the draft.
We had, I went back and I broke down just how many players from each team were selected. The Chiefs leading the way with 7, but at the positions, the Rams, most running backs of this era, Marshall Faulk in 2000, Gurley in 2018, and Steven Jackson in 2006. All 3 of those guys making the list from this particular era. Like I said, the quarterbacks finally came off the board during this round in round 2, and it went Mahomes over Manning and Jackson. And the thing that's interesting about that is you have Mahomes, who wasn't better than Manning in total points or points per game. You have Jackson, who was better than Mahomes in points per game, and he went 3rd. So I think this was a different of, okay, am I taking the best year and maybe hoping that he eventually becomes the best quarterback of all time in terms of best performance? But Peyton Manning in 2013, his yards, touchdowns, everything, just put him on a different level in terms of what he did by comparison to Mahomes or Jackson. So Dave, you kind of just got the 3rd guy there, taking Jackson with the first pick of round 3. Was that a choice by you to take a quarterback in that spot? And were you going to take one of these 3 guys just depending on how it fell?
I was going to take value for sure. And Lamar Jackson actually averaged more fantasy points per game than Patrick Mahomes in 2018. Peyton would have obviously been the creme de la creme. He scored more fantasy points than anybody, period. Averaged more fantasy points at 33.0 per game. But getting Lamar Jackson where I found him at the first pick of round 3. That's 32.6 fantasy points per game. He played 15 games last year. Only missed a game because the Ravens had nothing to play for in week 17. So he was outstanding. I hope it's the beginning of great things from Lamar Jackson, just like I hope that 2018 was the start of great things from Patrick Mahomes. 3 years from now, Jamie, we might be sitting here and both of these quarterbacks could put up better fantasy seasons than Peyton Manning did in 2013.
Heath, who would you have taken? Would it have been Mahomes? Would it have been Manning? Would it have been Jackson? What would have been your approach to the quarterbacks?
Yeah, I probably would have gone with Peyton Manning just because of that total value. That's what I was looking at early in the draft. But I do think George Maselli was probably just using the Adam Aizer approach and seeing that Patrick Mahomes was drafted later than Peyton Manning, and so he was a better value, and so that made him a better pick. And I also think, like, projecting forward, obviously I'd rather have Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, so I think that's why he's over them there.
Interesting approach that we all took. And again, Mahomes going ahead of Peyton Manning, ahead of Lamar Jackson. Even in every statistical category, he was not better than him, total points and points per game. All right, there's our first couple of rounds. When we come back, we're going to start to look at rounds 3, 4, and 5, and a couple of interesting wide receiver conversations coming up. Michael Thomas and his catches versus Calvin Johnson and his touchdowns. We'll tell you who was better next here on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Yesterday. We're taking a look at some of the best fantasy performances of all time from 1997 to 2019. And here we're talking about the ultimate fantasy draft, a draft that 8 members of our CBS Sports staff took part in to give you some of the best seasons of each particular player. I'm Jamie, that's Dave, that's Heath, that's Adam. Let's start with round 3 here as we take a look at some more great players coming off the board. And as you see here, we talked about Lamar Jackson, how he relates to Patrick Mahomes and Peyton Manning. A couple of top-tier wide receivers in this round, Michael Thomas and Calvin Johnson. We'll break them down in a second. More quarterbacks with Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady. And then you see some of these running backs, Adrian James, Shaun Alexander, and Chris Johnson. And let's start right there, guys. So James' season from 2000, Alexander from 2005, Chris Johnson from 2009. Heath, you took Aaron Rodgers. Did you give any consideration to taking one of those running backs at that spot with the 3rd pick in the round?
Yeah, I think when I sent my answers to you, the Aaron Rodgers pick was actually the one that I regretted the most. And it was just a little bit of a brain fart, I guess. But we got to the end of that draft, and I think everyone realized, wait, only 8 quarterbacks were drafted. And
right.
There just wasn't that big of a drop-off. I believe the last pick of the entire draft may have been Dante Culpepper, and he was like 1.5 points per game worse than Aaron Rodgers, who I took in the 3rd round. So, yeah, I think those running backs were definitely better value than the quarterbacks taken in round 3.
Adam, when you look at these 3 running backs, Adrian James and Chris Johnson had better total points and points per game than Shaun Alexander. You took Chris Johnson with the last pick in the round. Were you going running back there because you hadn't taken a running back with your first 2 picks, and were you thrilled to get Chris Johnson from his 2,000-yard season in 2009?
Yeah, he hit 2,000 rushing yards. We remember being part of that season in terms of fantasy players, and it was amazing. It was a heck of a ride. So yes, that was an easy pick for me. And Alexander probably should not have been taken in this format because he actually had a great non-PPR season. He had the 5th most non-PPR points of this era, but he only had 15 catches that year. So that kind of knocked him down a little bit. So yeah, Jamie, I mean, 2,000-yard rusher? Oh, come on, of course, Chris Johnson. It was a steal. What can I say?
A little foreshadowing for Adam's team. He likes 2,000-yard rushers. Nothing wrong with that if you're able to get them on your roster. Like I said, a couple of receivers go in this round. Michael Thomas with his season from last year, 2019, and Calvin Johnson with his season from 2011. When you look at these 2 guys, Dave, Thomas set the record for catches last season, 149, but he scores just 9 touchdowns. Calvin Johnson, under 100 catches with 96, but he scored 16 touchdowns. So not necessarily comparing these 2 guys because they were awesome. They were very close in terms of their total points and their points per game overall. But more of a strategy question. When you're approaching a PPR draft, are you looking for, if I were to tell you right now, one guy's getting X amount of catches but the touchdowns are low versus this guy getting X amount of touchdowns, how do you approach it when you're drafting your team? Do you look more for receptions or more for the score?
I mean, look at the math. If you do the math here, Michael Thomas had a total of 372 PPR points that season. Calvin Johnson, 2011, 96 catches, 16 touchdowns. That's great. 359 points. So Thomas gave you more points. They both played 16 games, so Thomas averaged more points per game. I think that makes it an open and shut case those catches count for something. And I think Michael Thomas would have been better for fantasy because of the 149 grabs that he had.
But again, though, it's record-breaking season, though. So let's just say it's, we take 20 catches off and they're closer in production, and one guy is statistically going to be year in, year out, finding the end zone more so than the other guy. But that other guy is going to catch the ball significantly more. So 30 catch difference as opposed to 50 catch difference. How much does that matter to you?
It still doesn't matter a ton as far as who it's not going to change my mind. I'm still interested in getting the wide receiver that's going to get a lot of targets and get a lot of footballs. Remember, these are the best seasons that Calvin Johnson and Michael Thomas had. So there are abnormal circumstances for each of them. And I think that it makes sense to go after catches if that's part of the scoring in your fantasy league.
Yes, and that was part of the reason why I took Michael Thomas over Calvin Johnson. He was better, and hopefully we see Michael Thomas continue to break records. Hard to expect another 149 catches, but over 140, we'll settle for that if he's able to maybe get 10 touchdowns and sort of offset the difference. Let's look now at round 4 as we continue to break down this draft, and we see this was a very interesting pick with the last selection in the 4th round, with Dave taking Odell Beckham. We'll tell you about that coming up in a second, but more great wide receivers with Julio Jones and Torry Holt, and some of the best running backs of all time, Jamal Charles and Brian Westbrook, with the guy, and Terrell Davis with the guy who we hope to be one of the best of all time with Saquon Barkley. So let's talk about these wide receivers here. So Dave took Beckham with his 2014 season. That was not the best season total points for Odell Beckham. That would have been 2015. But his rookie year, 2014, he missed 4 games. But it's the best points per game ever for a wide receiver. Beckham better than Randy Moss. Beckham was at 24.58. Moss was at 24, basically even. We'll worry about the decimal points later. So Dave, were you thrilled to get Beckham at this part of the draft, knowing how you were building your team with the best seasons based on their point per game average?
If I could do cartwheels, I would have been doing them in my living room, Jamie. Yes, Odell Beckham with the 24.6 PPR points per game would have ranked 17th among running backs. And here he was just sitting there because he didn't get a ton of points overall because he didn't play the first 4 games of the year. It was an unbelievable year for OBJ, and the kind of year that we're hoping to get from him at some point moving forward. Hopefully he can stay healthy enough to do it, but we know that he can because he's done it before.
Adam, you took Julio Jones with the first selection here. Did you consider Beckham at that spot? Maybe compare him also to Torry Holt, who had a monster season in 2003. Our buddy Chris Towers, he said in his recap of his team, all he did in this exercise was make people aware of just how good Torry Holt was, especially in 2003, he felt like he did his job.
Yeah, Torry Holt was amazing, but Julio Jones was better. Julio Jones averaged more points per game. He had more catches. He had fewer touchdowns, of course. That's the story of Julio Jones' career. But he had more catches than Torry Holt, more yards, and more fantasy points per game. So that was easy. But you know what? Beckham was a pretty sneaky pick, and I guess I didn't get it. And then I found out he averaged more fantasy points per game than anyone ever in this era since 1997. Bravo to Dave Richard. And you know how much I like factoring in ADP. I remember that year. Nobody was drafting him because he got hurt in training camp, missed the first 4 games. Dave Richard, steal of the draft. Way to go.
Might actually be with Odell Beckham. We might have some more steals coming out, though, as we continue to break it down. And let's talk about a couple of running backs that were drafted in this round, with Barkley from his 2018 season and Terrell Davis, 30 years earlier, with his selection of in 1998. Hopefully my math is correct on that. So we have Barkley going. He went ahead of Brian Westbrook, who was selected by Heath Cummings, his season from 2007. Heath, I'll get my thoughts together here. So Heath, you took Westbrook, who had the better points per game than Barkley did. Tell us about your selection, and were you considering Barkley or Davis with that spot?
Yeah, I was strongly considering Davis as well. I think it was kind of a coin flip between the two of them, but I like those catches. Dave talked about it with Michael Thomas. I mean, if you're talking about looking at pass production and projecting forward, if you've got a workhorse back who's also catching a ton of passes, I'll count on that guy as opposed to the big spikes and touchdowns. I'd much rather have the catches consistently on a week-to-week basis than 3 touchdowns one week and 0 the next.
Yeah, Brian Westbrook, a former colleague of ours here at CBS Sports, was part of this era when he joined us once upon a time when his career was over. I ended up with Terrell Davis. Heath mentioned it, sometimes you get those spikes in production. We know Terrell Davis, very big spike in production in the 1998 campaign, over 2,000 yards rushing, 23 total touchdowns. He was awesome in helping the Broncos win a Super Bowl. Unfortunately, though, career cut short, though, due to injuries. All right, so let's look now at round 5 as we continue to move on here, looking at the recap of our draft. And more great players coming off the board here. Le'Veon Bell, another smart pick by Dave, taking his best season in 2016, all the way down to another running back with Larry Johnson, who was selected from his 2006 campaign. So let's start with those running backs there, Dave. And so Bell only played 12 games that season. His best year for total points was 2014, but again, this was his best year points per game, just sticking with the same theme that you had following the best year on that particular number.
That was my game plan, because I just didn't want to go and look at the list and say, okay, I need a running back. Here's the running back that scored the most points that's still available. I'm going to take him. I wanted to actually think about it. And here's a guy who was suspended for the first 3 games of the year. Didn't play in week 17, so it wasn't like he was injured. He averaged 25.8 PPR fantasy points per game. That was better than he did in 2014 when he averaged 23 fantasy points per game, or 2017 when he averaged 22.6 points per game. Where the hell is this guy? Can Le'Veon Bell please come back and give us over 20 PPR points per game? He was awesome in 2016. I wish we could say that he would be awesome in 2020.
Yeah, as we know, it's been kind of a little bit of a downward spiral. The low light being the 2018 campaign when he did not play for the Pittsburgh Steelers or for fantasy owners. Heath, when you look at Larry Johnson, it's the most carries for running back in this era that we're talking about. 416 in that 2006 campaign. You followed the Chiefs your whole life. What do you remember about that Johnson season?
I mean, they just gave it to him. Oh, the game was so much different back then. There was no worry about this running back by committee. In fact, those were the coaches that were getting ostracized for doing something different. They just fed him, and this was a Chiefs offense that was under Dick Vermeil was just throwing up a ton of points each and every week. It was awesome. He was awesome for a very short period of time and then fell off a cliff.
The wide receivers that came off the board in this round, I think, is one of the more interesting groups because you got Brandon Marshall from 2015, Steve Smith from 2005, Demaryius Thomas from 2014, and Wes Welker from 2011. Adam, we talked about this on our Fantasy Football Today podcast. If I were to tell you Brandon Marshall's best year was with the Jets, and that Steve Smith's best season did not come with Cam Newton and came with Jake Delhomme, how surprised would you be?
More surprised about the Brandon Marshall one because I knew Cam Newton was never a guy, except for one season, his MVP season. He didn't throw a lot of touchdown passes. He always had Greg Olsen, too, who stole, about 7 touchdown passes. And I don't think he's ever thrown for 4,000 yards, or maybe once in his career. But he's usually around 3,900 to 4,000 yards. So that's not a huge surprise with Steve Smith, but with Brandon Marshall, yeah, very surprising. And when you see these wide receivers here, it kind of makes me feel like, man, I hope I have at least one stud wide receiver, if not 2, by this point in the draft. 2 of the Antonio Brown, Odell Beckham, Marvin Harrison, Randy Moss group, because these guys were really great. They had great seasons, but they were not those number 1 in fantasy football, unbelievable, blow you away, first round pick, top 5 pick in the draft types of players. But still, tremendous seasons.
And you had on your team Antonio Brown from 2014 and Julio Jones from 2015, as you alluded to. I thought one thing that was interesting about Demaryius Thomas and Wes Welker, you had Peyton Manning's best season in 2013 did not coincide with Thomas's best season, which was 2014, and the same thing with Welker and Brady. Brady's best season 2007, Welker's best season 2011. So those guys still put up good numbers despite their quarterbacks taking a slight step back from what was their best campaign. All right, that wraps up our first 5 rounds. When we come back, we're going to get into round 6 to the end of the draft and looking at a couple of wide receivers that certainly were very good in their time. Hines Ward in 2002, and we all remember that Josh Gordon season from 2013. Coming up next here on Fantasy Football Yesterday. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Yesterday. We're recapping some of the best players from 1997 to 2019. We're talking about our ultimate fantasy draft here, and we're up to round 6. I'm Jamie, that's Dave, that's Heath, that's Adam. Let's take a look at the round 6 results as we continue to show you how we built our teams with some of the best seasons of some of the best players of all time. DeAndre Hopkins all the way down to Clinton Portis is the list we're looking at here, and a couple of wide receivers that jump off the page. Hines Ward from 2002 and Josh Gordon from 2013. And the reason I say that is because Hines Ward, we know the Steelers have had some great wide receivers over this era. Hines Ward started it all. 2002, he was catching passes not from Ben Roethlisberger, but from the great Tommy Maddox and Cordell Stewart. So, Dave, do we give Hines Ward enough credit for what he started? Because from Ward to Antonio Brown and Emmanuel Sanders, from Brown to Juju Smith-Schuster, and what could be Juju Smith-Schuster to Deontay Johnson. It was kind of this season for Ward that kind of brought back this resurgence of wide receiver greats in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, right, because let's not slight Lynn Swann and John Stallworth and all the greats that they had there before, but this was an amazing year for Hines Ward. 112 catches. He never had over 100 before or after this season. 1,300 yards was also a career high for him. 12 touchdowns was career high for him. Let's call it what it is. It's a career year for him, and it ranks 16th best in our era among wide receivers in PPR. So getting Hines Ward 16th best in round 6, that's one of the biggest steals in this draft.
Our producer, Andrew Baumer, when we were going through our notes for this draft, he said, it seems like most people think of Hines Ward as like a great blocking wide receiver and forget just how good he was as a pass catcher, and this year sort of illustrates that. Heath, I want to ask you not just about Josh Gordon in this round, but I didn't want to slight the guy that you drafted one round earlier in T.O. So talk about just how special Josh Gordon's season was in 2013, but also how special T.O.'s year was from 2002.
Well, yeah, I mean, for Gordon, it's just that potential that we saw that year we've never been able to give up on. You want to know how good it was? Look at what fantasy managers have overlooked in the last 3 or 4 years and continue to put him on rosters. He was absolutely amazing, and under the Azer scoring system would grade out even better because he basically came out of nowhere. So, yes, that was phenomenal. Owens really gets overlooked, not just in this, but he's going to get overlooked later in the week, too, and I'm going to get mad about it. But his season, because he didn't play a full 16 games, you don't really see this. The only receivers that averaged more fantasy points per game and played at least 14 games were Antonio Brown, Marvin Harrison, Randy Moss, and Michael Thomas. So I thought he was a steal in round 5.
And we're talking about T.O. during his time with San Francisco. A lot of people look at T.O. and the sit-ups in the driveway with Philadelphia and how things fell apart in Dallas. Forget just how great he was, thankfully, in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Heath talking about the case that he will make for T.O. to be on the Mount Rushmore. We'll see if Heath is able to win that argument and T.O. gets among the wide receiver greats. Let's look now at round 7, and we see some more of the greats as we're continuing to build our teams here. Ricky Williams from 2002, another situation to Josh Gordon. Fantasy managers were chasing that couple of seasons for Williams, 2002, 2003. He was just awesome in that 2002 campaign, but Dave Wanstead and the Dolphins, they ran him into the ground, and Ricky Williams decided to retire. Never was able to recapture that greatness that he had in that 2-year stretch with Miami. Alvin Kamara, another great running back that came off the board here, and you see a couple modern day guys, Kamara and Tyreek Hill from his 2018 season. Again, the Chiefs, the most players drafted in this draft that we held, with 7 players, 3 from that 2018 campaign: Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, and Travis Kelce. Adam, Ricky Williams was special in 2002. Barry Sanders, one of the best careers of all time, cut a little bit short. He's another guy that retired probably a year or two sooner than we would have hoped. But you look at Sanders in 1997, that was his penultimate season when he ran for 2,000 yards. Just talk about that campaign and what you remember about Barry Sanders and what he was able to accomplish at his year 30 season.
I remember Thanksgiving, always waiting for Barry Sanders. What I most remember about Barry Sanders was he might have 10 carries for 12 yards, and then he would have 11 carries for 100 yards and a touchdown, because he was bound to take one to the house eventually. He would just break your back with these unbelievable moves, and he was definitely my favorite player because he didn't spike the football. He just gave the ball to the ref. He was a humble superstar. I love that. Before all the stupid sack dances and all the celebrations, Barry Sanders just went out and crushed everybody every week. And look, on my fantasy team, this is my second 2,000-yard running back. I think that in fantasy football, I'm just going to propose this. You should have seasonal milestones. If one of your players rushes for 2,000 yards, you get bonuses in your fantasy championship. Somehow, it would have to be retroactive, obviously, because it happens in week 17. 5,000 passing yards, bonus in your fantasy championship. 1,800 receiving yards, bonus. So if we institute those bonuses, they will be very, very extreme, and I will have the best team in this all-time draft because I have 2 2,000-yard rushers.
All right, Heath, why don't you regulate that one?
Nope, we're not going to do that. And that would be the only way that Azer would have a very good team.
Retroactive bonuses, the way to save Adam Azer's fantasy team. All right, so there we go with round 7, and I want to take a look now at round 8 as we take a look at another great group of players here, starting with another 2,000-yard rusher that Adam took with Adrian Peterson from the 2012 campaign. LaShawn McCoy was fantastic in 2011. Two tight ends off the board here with Jordan Reed in 2015 and Tony Gonzalez in 2004 to Dave. And I think people forget just how good Charlie Garner was in that 2002 season for the Raiders. I'm going to give you guys a trivia question. I'll give you the answer when we come back. There were 3 teams that did not have a player drafted in this era from the draft that we took part of. I'll tell you the 3 teams coming back in our final block here, but think about that. But when we look at the players that were drafted here, you had the running backs starting with Peterson in 2012 and McCoy in 2011. Adam, just take us through those 2 running backs in particular, how good they were. And it seems as if, taking guys that ran for 2,000 yards was something that you were targeting.
You're talking about Adrian Peterson? Yeah, I think that he was also a workhorse, and that's something that has sort of gone away. So I thought Peterson was a nice throwback in that regard. And obviously, this is one of my last picks, and as we said earlier in the show, I was a little bit weak on running back, but it's just hard to pass up somebody who rushes for 2,000 yards. And I just love the work that he got. I know he wasn't always super involved in the passing game, and this is a PPR exercise. And McCoy is someone who made my all-decade team when we looked at just 2010 to 2019, because he had a lot of seasons as a top 5 running back. I think LeSean McCoy is going to end up going down as one of the most underappreciated running backs of our time, because he didn't have a 2,000-yard rushing season. He didn't have a LaDainian Tomlinson season. Didn't have a Priest Holmes season. He had a really, really good career, and he did it early in his career. He did it a little bit later in his career. So these 2 guys did it in different ways, but they both really stood out. McCoy, more of a decade-long phenomenon. Peterson, of course, was that as well, but this particular season was just off the charts with those 2,000 yards.
Yeah, McCoy over 1,600 total yards in 2011, but the thing that stood out was the 20 total touchdowns. The 2 tight ends that came off the board in round 8, Jordan Reed, another player similar to Josh Gordon, similar to Ricky Williams. You're always chasing that one season that player had. In particular, for Reed, it was this 2015 campaign. And Dave, you took Tony Gonzalez with the last pick of round 8, finally getting your tight end. Would you have taken Reed over Gonzalez? Because we know Gonzalez has the much better career. But Reed had the better season. Reed was at 17.7 points per game. Gonzalez was at 16.9.
I was worried about that decision and whether or not I would have done Reed over Gonzalez just because of the points per game aspect. But I honestly think that if I was given that choice, I would have taken Gonzalez, even though he didn't average quite as many PPR points as Jordan Reed. It was about 1 point difference. I just need to have somebody who was stable and playing 16 games just in case something came up in this process where we said, well, because you've got so many guys on your team that didn't play 16 games, it's going to dock you. And it does dock me at the point when we talk about total points scored. But Gonzalez is a Hall of Famer. Figured you could use some Hall of Famers on the team. I felt the difference between Jordan Reed and Tony Gonzalez really didn't make that much of an impact. So the decision was to go with Tony G, who has like 3 top 10 finishes. He was the best fantasy tight end until Gronk came around. It was a pretty easy choice at that point.
Dave going more for locker room chemistry and team camaraderie.
That's right.
As opposed to the best season. So differing from his
Who's
strategy
bringing
there.
donuts on Friday?
That's right. Who's bringing donuts on Fridays and who's going to help your fantasy team more? Maybe Jordan Reed for 1 season. Career obviously goes to Tony Gonzalez. All right, when we come back here on Fantasy Football Yesterday, we're going to break down our teams. Going to take a look at, did Lamar Jackson help you? Did Marshall Faulk make you dominate? What about LaDainian Tomlinson? We'll tell you about the best teams, total points, best teams point per game next here on Fantasy Football Yesterday. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Yesterday. We're recapping some of the best players of all time, their best seasons of all time from 1997 to 2019. And here's a look at round 9. Antonio Freeman. Who can't forget Antonio Freeman from 1998? One of 3 Packers wide receivers drafted in this era, with Jordy Nelson from 2014, Devontae Adams from 2018. Matt Forte, another underappreciated running back. His season in 2014 was special. Dallas Clark, one of the best memes you'll find on Twitter. His running through the defense. I believe it's in a Madden game. Just a lot of fun to watch how Dallas Clark was operating as the tight end for the Colts. Another tight end, George Kittle, on this list. And Adam finally gets his quarterback there at number 72 overall with Dante Culpepper. Amazing what would have happened if Culpepper's knee was healthy. Maybe the Dolphins would have been great as opposed to passing on Drew Brees and taking Dante Culpepper. So there's the 9 rounds that we drafted, 72 players. The answer to the trivia question I posed to you in the previous segment was, which 3 teams did not have a player drafted in our draft of this era, 1997 to 2019? The Bills, the Bengals, and the Bucks. Three teams, no players drafted, so unfortunately those guys, not a lot of representation of great players. All right, let's take a look at our teams here as we break down our ultimate fantasy draft. And again, different approaches, total points versus points per game, taking into account, for some reason, average draft position when building your roster. I don't even know what that means, but Adam Azer can explain it to you when we look at his team. But let's start with your team, Dave. Lamar Jackson, Marshall Faulk, two players that highlight your roster.
I have the third best all-time fantasy quarterback. I've got 3 top 13 running backs by PPR fantasy points per game. I have the best wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game in PPR. A Hall of Fame tight end, a couple other really good running backs, Anquan Boldin and Antonio Freeman.
Don't discount Anquan.
Well, yeah, Anquan was amazing, and 2018 was one of his best years. Antonio Freeman, 2008, my bad. And Freeman is in the Packers Hall of Fame. So I think that this is obviously a stacked team. I wish I was a little bit stronger at wide receiver, I admit it. But I've got 4 running backs that have been amazing for fantasy, and Lamar Jackson's just getting started.
And as we'll tell you when we break down who has the best team total points, who has the best team points per game, you see a little bit of a difference here. Adam, when we look at your team, highlighted by 3 2,000-yard rushers. Chris Johnson, Adrian Peterson, or maybe only 2. I think maybe I misspoke there. 2,000-yard rushers. So you waited on quarterback with Dante Culpepper. Do you think that hurt your team overall?
No. I mean, Dante Culpepper was so good. The only quarterback in this era to finish number 1 in fantasy points 3 straight seasons. No, that was actually probably the best thing I did, because this team is horrible. I mean, this is a complete mess. This is hot garbage. I mean, Jimmy Graham in the first round. The pick before that was Randy Moss in 2007. You know how much better he was than Jimmy Graham in 2013? I basically feel like there should have been 7 teams playing and not 8, because I got the short straw here. Horrible team. I'm ashamed of it. But if we're playing with bonuses for 2,000 rushing yards, and I forgot about the 400 carry bonus that I get with Larry Johnson. So when you factor in all the bonus points, Jamie, this team might finish 6th instead of 8th.
All right, so you can definitely do retroactive. That's the best way to do it when building these rosters. You have plenty of time to go back and look at all those bonus points. Let's take a look at Heath's team here. And big surprise, no Chiefs. Despite 7 Chiefs going in this draft, you took none of them, Heath, but you did take a couple of Packers, Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams. Thankfully, those guys are still going strong. Tell us about your team here. And I think Charlie Gardner's season in 2002 gets highly overlooked.
Yeah, I'm in a little bit of a loss here because Adam said all the things I was planning on saying. I was just going to talk about how bad his team was. But no, as much as I was disappointed by Aaron Rodgers and my decision-making with that, what really worked out well for me was the Dallas Clark pick. Dallas Clark in 2009 scored more total fantasy points that year than Tony Gonzalez ever did. Dallas Clark averaged more fantasy points that year than Tony Gonzalez ever did. That was one of the steals of the draft as well, if all we're looking at is how they did that one year. I like my strength at wide receiver, but you need to have 4 running backs just with how many more points they scored than the wide receivers of the same category.
And Heath with a little recency bias. McCaffrey 2019, Adams 2018, Kamara 2018. Not bad to go that route, though, with how good those players are. All right, we'll go through my team quickly because I want to show you the list of total points and points per game. Picking second, easy to take Tomlinson after Dave took Marshall Faulk. I think I have 4 very good running backs, another 2,000-yard rusher and Terrell Davis. The 3rd best tight end in terms of points per game ever was Travis Kelce in 2018 behind Gronk in 2011 and Jimmy Graham in 2013. Josh Gordon's 2013 season was amazing. Another very underrated fantasy performer is Andre Johnson in his 2008 season. Was the best performance of his career. Getting Drew Brees in round 4 was, I think, a steal because Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, depending on what site you look at, those were the 2 best fantasy quarterbacks that season. Brees actually, if you look at it, was the last quarterback to repeat back-to-back years, number 1, 2011 and 2012. So let's take a look at the best teams based on total points, and that would be me. I had the best performance when you factor in the total points of the entire 9-man roster that we have. Heath at number 2 and Dave all the way down at the bottom there because Dave took a different approach. So you see my team is the best in terms of total points. Dave is the worst. When you flip it and you see the points per game, Dave is the best. Heath, the most consistent team, finishing 2nd in both categories. I was 3rd in points per game per player. Adam, you were just bad all the way around. How would you change that?
Participation trophy, Jamie. Participation trophy.
What would you have changed, Adam? Give me one pick you would have changed.
I would have somehow managed to pick 7th instead of 8th, and I would have ended up with Randy Moss. But I would have changed Jimmy Graham, taking a running back who scored a bunch of points.
All right, so we have a fun week coming up for you here. Tomorrow we're going to get into our Mount Rushmore at every position here on Fantasy Football Yesterday, but all week long we're breaking down the best performances, some of the worst performances, some of the surprise performances. It's going to be a fun week here on CBS Sports HQ. For Adam, for Heath, for Dave, I'm Jamie. Thank you for watching our first episode of Fantasy Football Yesterday. Want more of the Fantasy Football Today podcast and non-stop year-round fantasy advice? It's simple. Hit the subscribe button and hang with us all throughout the year.